Good morning, my name is Juliet, welcome back to my channel. Today is the third video in my series, The 7 Myths of a Knowledge-Rich Curriculum. Myth number 3, standards in UK schools have been in decline since the 1970s because of progressive methods. So Robert Peel states in his book Progressively Worse, progressive education is as close as we can get to the root cause of educational failure. So Robert Peel states quite clearly that education is failing in the UK, that standards are going down, and it's all because of progressive education methods. Robert Peel also makes the claim that hard-working teachers are not getting the results they deserve because they have been let down by the ideas fed to them by a deficient education thought world. So this is really important in this sort of ideological battle for those who are currently pushing a knowledge-rich curriculum and to be delivered through traditional teaching methods. It's really important that they make a point of saying that school standards are in decline as a result of the progressive movement in the 1960s and 70s. It's actually very difficult to really assess educational standards in the UK across a period of time from the 1960s to now. That's 50-year history, because so much changes across that time politically in terms of who is educated, who isn't educated, educational policies, curriculum design, and also other policies or things that are happening in the country that aren't directly to do with education but may impact on education. For example, Sure Start, which was begun in 2000. So a caveat first of all is you can really argue three ways with educational standards. You can find evidence to say that educational standards have declined, though actually I would say that evidence is the most dodgy. You can find evidence to say that standards have gone up since the 1960s in education, and you can find evidence to say that standards haven't really changed, particularly in the last 50 years. I come from a social science background, and I come from a psychological background, and psychology is a science, but it's a science of human behaviour, and therefore we have to be really careful when we report on experimental findings to point out, for example, that this was only one study on one group of participants. And how we develop our evidence base in psychology is through replication, because a replication of an experimental effect improves the reliability of the findings. And so that's really the same with educational standards in the UK. In order to actually answer the question, are standards in UK schools declining, increasing or stagnating, you need to look at more than one piece of evidence. In Robert Peel's book Progressively Worse, which is available free online if you want to look for it, which is always again a little bit of a warning sign to me, if an organisation pushes out free material that they say is free of political bias, I would argue when it's being pushed out for free, they want as many people to read it as possible. And so I would argue it's probably not free of political bias. Anyway, so Robert Peel is a history teacher who went through the Teach First programme. Robert Peel did leave teaching after, I think, 2 years after his Teach First programme finished, and went off and I think did further study. But he now does work in the West London Free School, which is the free school started by Toby Young, who has been hitting the press considerably in the last few days over his appointment to the university watchdog. And in fact today he's just resigned from that position. Now, as I've already argued in my first video looking at myths 1 and 2, I don't believe there is a dichotomy between traditional teachers and progressive teachers, and traditional methods and progressive methods. I also don't believe that teachers focus on skills only and don't teach knowledge. So that was dealt with in my previous video. So please go and see my previous videos for myths 1 and 2. But as I've said, it's really important for the knowledge-rich curriculum champions to argue that without a knowledge-rich curriculum, all is lost in the UK education system. So, Robert Peel, he's based the fact that standards are declining on one piece of evidence, and it's a paper that I went to go and look for because he's quoted it, and I couldn't quite make sense of what he was quoting. So he quoted that reading scores in the UK population steadily improved through 1948 to 1960, and that they then stagnated from 1960 onwards. Now, the reason Robert Peel is making this point in the introduction to the book Progressively Worse is because what he's trying to demonstrate is that up until 1960, traditional ideology and traditional teaching methods dominated UK schools. So Robert Peel wants to make the point of saying that actually everything was hunky-dory until the progressives got involved in the 1960s. And once the progressives got involved in the 1960s, well, education has been in decline ever since. So I went to look at the actual paper that he was quoting from to try and make a bit more sense of it. He did miss out one crucial word though, and that was average reading score. And that's actually really important because the average reading score of the population rose between 1948 and 1960, and that makes absolutely perfect sense because prior to 1944, lots of children were illiterate because they didn't get an education or a good education. The Butler Act made it compulsory for all children to attend education. There will be a lag of a couple of years as those children enter school and begin to learn. And in fact, I think Wikipedia talks about the Butler Act really only coming into effect properly in 1947. So it's really unsurprising, and I think has absolutely nothing to do with progressive or traditional teaching methods. But it's very unsurprising that the average reading score in the UK improved across 1948 to 1960. So the fact that the average reading score stagnated between 1960 and 1988, which also is shown in the actual paper, just suggests we have reached saturation point in terms of making sure that all young people were reading. And that average reading rate will stagnate because those who left school before the Butler Act or those who never went to school certainly would have still been alive, and therefore the average reading score would generally stagnate at that point. He then talks about functional illiteracy and the fact that functional illiteracy has remained stable since World War II, and he quotes it at 20%. He says that 20% of the UK population are functionally illiterate. In other words, he's saying 20% of the UK population do not read and write well enough to take part fully in society. For example, reading train timetables or being able to type a letter. Going to the actual paper, he has overestimated that. The actual paper says 17%, and actually some recent research suggests it's around 15%. And that is concerning, that 15% of our population are functionally illiterate. But the causes for that are complex. And the causes of that may partly to do with schooling, but often are much more to do with life events in those people's lives, and missing school, truancy, potentially low aspiration, low expectation, as well as potentially undiagnosed learning difficulties. So to blame progressive methods for functional illiteracy, which he argues haven't changed since World War II, doesn't hold water either. So I then went off to see, okay, so what evidence can I find? And we're always hearing in the news, aren't we, how terrible our PISA results are, the international tests that compare us to other countries, how we don't do very well in the rankings. So I was very aware that I needed to go and have a look at the PISA results. The international test that all 15-year-olds in 65 countries carry out, and they started in the year 2000, although the argument is that the 2000 results are unreliable, and therefore really we tend to look from 2006 onwards at the PISA results, and they happen every I think it's every 3 years or every 2 years, I can't remember, and they have a focus each time. So then there's a maths focus, a science focus, and an English focus. So, PISA tests, what they tend to measure is, and it's interesting, that they actually measure the application of skills to unfamiliar contexts. So PISA tests aren't particularly measuring just knowledge, just what do children know. They're measuring how the application of that knowledge, which is sort of a skills-based approach. And I'm also going to talk about another series of tests called the TIMSS tests, which measure mathematical and scientific ability. And they started in 1995. So I've got two international tests. TIMSS tend to measure or emphasises assessing knowledge, and PISA's emphasise assessing skills. So they're two tests measuring similar content, but in a slightly different way. So I'm going to use those two international tests, and you can find out lots about them online, how they're carried out, how reliability and validity is built into them, just by looking them up online. And I'll put a couple of links down below to some of the papers that I've looked at. I'm going to be looking at both of those because it's much better to look at more than one piece of evidence if you want to make a point. So, what do the PISA tests tell us? Well, if you think about some of the news headlines, the PISA tests we haven't done particularly well in. So in 2012, the UK was ranked 23rd for reading, 26th for maths, and 21st for science out of 65 countries. That doesn't sound very good. UK would expect, I guess, to be at the top. Why? I don't know why I would expect to be at the top, but it seems that we would expect to be at the top. And then in 2015, the most recent results, we really haven't shifted that much. So we were 22nd for reading, 27th for maths, and the biggest move was we were 15th for science in 2015. So looking at the PISA test alone, our performance hasn't really changed much between 2012 and 2015. Looking overall at PISA from 2000 and 2006, basically our results have been stable since 2006. And if we look at the OECD average, our science and reading results have been stable and better than average since 2006. For the last 11 years they've been stable but also slightly above the OECD average, whereas our maths scores have been around average and they've also been stable since 2006. So certainly from 2006 there is absolutely no evidence that our educational standards are in decline. Now if you take the 2000 PISA results, it actually looks like our educational standards have significantly increased. But as I've said, you can't really look at the 2000 results because it was the first time that the tests were set and therefore they lack reliability. But if I were Robert Peel trying to make a political point, pretending that I wasn't, I could use the PISA results to actually demonstrate the opposite, that progressive teaching methods have meant that standards have gone up in the UK from the year 2000. So, what is interesting is that PISA also measure things like, and let me just start to read this, like sense of belonging to school and schoolwork related anxiety. And sadly in 2015, and this might be due to the introduction of the reformed national curriculum in 2010 and again in 2014 through Gove, which is really very content heavy at the moment and has increasingly high expectations for young people. But sadly, our sense of belonging as a nation to school is below the OECD average. So children in this country don't feel like they belong to their school. And we know sense of belonging is very important for attainment. When you feel like you are valued and that you belong to something, you're more likely to put effort in and want to actually do well. So that's really worrying that children's sense of belonging is low in the UK. And unfortunately, schoolwork related anxiety in the UK is higher than the OECD average. So children not only don't feel like they belong to school, but they're also very, very anxious about school. However, if we look at the TIMSS, which is the maths and science assessments that tend to be more knowledge related, which were started in 1995, we've actually seen an upward trend in maths scores from 1995. All the way from 1995 to 2007 there was a significant upward trend in maths scores and then they stabilised from about 2007 onwards. Science, on the other hand, was stable up until 2007 and then there was a decline in science scores on TIMSS between 2007 and 2011, and then it's been stable ever since. So PISA results suggest a stable picture, but don't go back as far as 1995. And the TIMSS results suggest an improving picture, but one that has now also stabilised. So they're pretty much saying the same thing from about 2006, 2007 onwards. Generally, standards in maths and science haven't particularly shifted much. There's been a very slight decline in the TIMSS science score, but nothing actually really major. And generally, things haven't changed very much. So I found no evidence to support Robert Peel's claim that standards in the UK education system have gone down over time. And using two huge studies, because it is really hard to examine standards in UK education, I'm finding evidence of stagnation, if anything else. And you could argue stagnation's a problem, but is stagnation anything to do with the ideology within schools? And I would argue it doesn't have anything to do with that. Stagnation probably has a lot more to do with what's happening outside of schools, around schools. Something else we've also got to remember is Robert Peel talks as if the progressives took over the classroom in the 1960s and that was it, that we've been moving more and more towards a progressive education ever since. Well, it doesn't work like that, does it? In 1991, when the Conservatives were in power, there was very much, John Major very much pushed following Margaret Thatcher's government. She was very much wanting to focus on numeracy and literacy and the basic stuff. And John Major, when he came into power, he actually launched the Back to Basics campaign. And this led to a reform of assessment at O-level and CSE. Those who are old enough might remember O-levels and CSEs. And they became the new GCSEs with a much higher emphasis on short tests and a reduction in emphasis on coursework. And this was further supported by the Labour government of 1997 when David Blunkett was the Education Secretary, and he actually brought in the National Literacy and Numeracy Strategy, which meant that teachers had to do an hour of literacy and an hour of numeracy a day at primary, and it was a very prescribed curriculum, a very knowledge-rich curriculum. So to argue that the progressives took over in the 1960s and have been making schools more progressive ever since is not borne out by just a simple cursory look at education and political history from the 1970s onwards. So why are there certain voices arguing or suggesting that the system is damagingly progressive? Well, going back to 1988, when the Conservatives were in power, 1988 we had the Education Reform Act and the introduction of the national curriculum. And the 1988 Education Reform Act was intentionally set up to create a market in education, with schools directly competing with each other. The belief was that if you created a market in education with schools in competition with each other, you would raise standards in all schools, because schools would be competing for pupils, competing for money. And this was why a national curriculum was needed, because the only way to create competition was if you were teaching children all the same things, and then you could measure the assessments that were carried out. So you could say this school is better than this school because so many percentage of pupils achieved an A to C in this school compared to pupils in that school. So the marketisation of education really began in 1988. And in recent years, since Michael Gove's time as Education Secretary, it's gained traction again. And this is because there's a lot of money to be made in education. And there are a lot of people who are involved in education who are profit-making organisations. There are also quite a lot of people who own a lot of wealth in this country who are donating to academy chains such as ARC. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why are they donating to these schools that are outside of local authority control? And why are they not donating or paying more taxes into local authority education? And the cynical side of me, and there is evidence out there to prove it, is because though these academy chains themselves are not for profit, they are linked to profit-making organisations. And it's been estimated that the educational technology market is worth around $8 billion. The ARC Academy chain was set up by hedge fund managers, and it has a huge amount of money donated. I think it's been like £3 million donated through some of the richest people in this country. I do not believe they are doing it purely for philanthropic means. Otherwise they would be giving that money into all schools, not just certain academy chains. So, to achieve necessary market conditions, the monopoly of the state provision has to be broken down. At the same time, the market venture of competition education is introduced, and this then necessitates standardised curriculum, standardised testing, performance-related type pay. And this is what we're seeing happening right now in education. And I really fear for the future generations, because there will not be any state education left in this country. Education will be run in order to create profits, just like the healthcare system is run in the United States, and that's beginning to happen here as well. If we look at the big state institutions that we have, education and health, they are systematically being broken down, and we are systematically being told that they are failing, and we are told they are failing because they are too big and they are too inefficient, and therefore we need to bring in the private sector to run them. And ultimately this means that certain people will profit from the money we pay in taxes to support education and health in this country. And this is coming, and this is not me going off onto a conspiracy rant. The evidence is there, but you only have to look at the American system, and you know there's often this talk, isn't there, about if America sneezes, the UK catches the cold. If we look at their charter education system and the direction they're going, you can see very clearly the direction that we're going in. So these market ideals have nothing to do with what is best for learners. However, in order to promote the ideals, reality of what teachers do must be distorted, and it must be presented in a crude black and white way. So when anyone dares to question the emphasis on a knowledge-rich curriculum, they are accused of being a progressive, a left-wing idealist. I am not questioning, and I've said this through all my videos so far, the value of a knowledge-rich education. I agree we need cultural literacy. We need everyone to understand our history in the arts, in politics, in literacy, and there are hierarchical skills that we need to learn in the maths and the sciences in order that we can contribute. But I am arguing that the drive for the knowledge-rich curriculum has nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with breaking down the state system so that private interests can make money out of education. So, I hope I've argued that myth number 3, there is no evidence for. Though it's very hard to say categorically whether standards in education have stagnated or gone up, there is very little to no evidence that educational standards have gone down, and there is no evidence that it has anything to do with progressive teaching methods.